Okay, great.
All right, everybody, welcome to this elective. Just point out, if you make sure, come on in. You just make sure that, if you pay a little bit of attention to the camera, just make sure that if I go too far over. Okay. Yeah, so anyway, come on, sit down, and we'll get started. Per usual, the way that I started these all along is that in the event that there's something you don't understand or something that I say or I'm speaking too quickly, anything along those lines, please say something, raise your hand, do something along those lines so that I know that you don't understand or I know that I can say it in a different way because I want you to understand what I'm saying. This elective is focused on winning from the web speech. The idea is that in some ways this is a bit more of a perhaps an advanced elective, in the sense that it assumes that you know how to make book speech, how to know a little bit about the structure of it. These provide strategies on how you can better focus and better tailor your book speech to be something more powerful in the debate round. Oftentimes, it's the case that judges seem to not value or not know how to judge a web speech. You often get things like a judge saying, well, your partner gave a very excellent extension. You won this debate. You won. Why? Because your partner gave a very good extension. Oh, also, the web speech was okay. And then they just move on. They don't say anything more. They don't say anything more to you. They don't tell you what to improve. They don't tell you what to be better or what was bad. Except in general terms, they say things like, well, you could have had more structure, or you could have said more things. And none of that is descriptive, and none of that is helpful to getting you to become a better web speaker. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about what the role of the web speaker in a debate is first. And then we're going to talk about two separate strategies that I think are very valuable. As some of you know, because I've mentioned it in a couple of debates that I've judged, I was a web speaker when I started, but also throughout my debate career, I gave web speeches. And I found that these were two strategies that were relatively useful as far as the mindset of approaching the web speech. It makes you a much more strategic thinker, and it allows you to view the debate in a way that is much more valuable when you're going to stand up and give that speech. Okay? The first strategy, of course, is that you're going to make your partner's job easier, which obviously, by extension, will make your job easier. Secondly, the second strategy is know what you want the judge to think. You are kind of an adjudicator in some sense. You are a judge from that web speaking role. You're evaluating the debate in the same way that you think the judge is evaluating it, and so you're going to want to think these things in very similar ways. So, let's talk about the role of the web speaker. Because the role of the web speaker, boiled down to one sentence, is you're going to convince the judge that you won the debate, that your team specifically, second government, second opposition, that you were victorious, that you did the best job. And that's important. It's important because there's a function. Those speech serves a very particular function within the debate. That function is often described in a wrong or incomplete way, where people tell you that you have to provide a summary for the round. You have to summarize the debate. You have to highlight what your team said. You have to talk about the contribution that your team made, and that you're basically being descriptive all the way throughout the debate. You're saying, this team talked about this argument, the opposition talked about this argument, and then my partner said this, and therefore we're happy to propose. That's an incomplete version of the role of the speaker. Because a more complete way of thinking of it is that you're providing the judge a lens or a perspective or an angle by which they can view the debate round and evaluate it, which emphasizes the contribution that your partner made in suggesting that it's very important, or suggesting that's an important argument within the debate. What I mean by this is that in some ways, you're going to be telling the judge what was and what was not important in ways that have yet to be explained. Because no speaker before you could do an absolutely perfect job explaining why their argument is important. And so it's left up to the wit speakers to actually identify arguments that go up against each other, that have yet to be evaluated against one another. So oftentimes, and what has happened in many debates so far, is that one team will have a particular assumption or a particular argument that they make, and then the opposition will have another one, or second opposition will have another one that they talk about. So first argument and second opposition have said things that are very important, that haven't directly been analyzed against one another as far as what is or is not important. The first argument will talk about why space exploration is a necessary thing for the international world to do. And then second opposition can talk about, in fact, why it's much better for governments to do, because it's, nationalism is sometimes an important value with regards to making people excited about what a government is or isn't doing. The whip speaker is then there to explain how those arguments compare against each other, and why, of course, yours, the argument that your member speaker made, is more important, or is better, or should be evaluated in a way that would make it look as though it were better. And that's what you're doing in some sense. You're providing more of that criteria for the judge to evaluate the debate round. Because oftentimes, all the judge has are the notes from each speaker beforehand. This is really the first time that they get an in-depth look at different ways that they could view the debate. There's a government side way of looking at the debate, and there's an opposition side way of looking at the debate. And because there are these two competing conceptions, I'm choosing between which ones are correct maybe, or neither of them are correct. Or maybe just they made me see the debate in a different light. That's the idea behind it. It's more than a summary, it's a comparison. It's a comparative piece of analysis that examines different arguments and puts them against each other that have yet to be done beforehand. Additionally, what you want to do as a whip speaker, of course the very first thing that you want to do, is that you want to fulfill that function of the whip speech that we just spoke about. In the sense that you want to fulfill that role. You want to be you want to be the person who is making those comparisons, who is explaining why an argument versus another argument is going to win or is going to lose. But oftentimes, the manner in which you go about doing this is highly individualistic. Many people do whip speeches many different ways. Some people are very mechanical about them, and they know exactly what they want to focus on, point by point by point. And they say, this argument and this argument and this impact versus that impact, and therefore, this is the conclusion that you have to draw. It's very mechanical, it's very scientific in its approach. And that's fine, that's great. But some people are even much more rhetorical. They'll stand up and they will rhetorically flourish. They'll say things like, they're talking very beautiful language, and they'll explain to you exactly, or not even exactly, but generally, why you have to value this argument because you think that. Things along those lines. That's the idea, in that it's individualistic because it's a way in which you are best able to be persuasive. There's a little bit of confidence involved because you're up here almost directing. You're up here giving the speech. If you want to have a little bit, let's say the debate before you is very boring, or there's nothing, it's not that there's nothing interesting about it, but everyone just doesn't seem energized. Then you can get up there and be that energized person and be like, this debate was about these three things, and we think it's very important that you recognize why opposition has won this debate. You stand up and you do something like that, the judge will look up and start paying more attention. And that's the idea. That's what you want to do. In some sense, that's where that individualism comes from. Because you need to be able to recognize not only what needs to be done within the context of the round, but how you would be most comfortable delivering a persuasive speech. And that's why it's different in a lot of ways from the other speeches beforehand. You have more leeway to play around with, and this is actually why people struggle with it. Because there is that leeway. Because there's more freedom to do something that sometimes isn't as persuasive, or sometimes you're trying out a new way of doing it, and the judge is like, no, that was not, that didn't work, or that wasn't great. And so that's what you want to be trying out different ways of actually pursuing or actually completing a wit speech. Either way, of course, whatever way you give it, you want to be providing that framework. The framework by which you think the judge should evaluate the debate round. And the reason, of course, that's important is because that framework is necessary. Beforehand, some speakers are doing little bits of it. Speakers all beforehand, the member speeches, the Prime Minister, the Leader of Opposition, they are all providing little pieces of framework and are engaging in saying that the other side's framework isn't good. You shouldn't think that this is important. And it's finally when you get to the wit speech where you can then say, here's what actually is or is not important as far as how you should evaluate the round. Because that's what you want the judge to value. And ultimately, you want to focus on the type of framework that will make the judge think that you were victorious. You won't always be able to convince them that that's the case. But sometimes you will be able to. Sometimes your wit speech will be so good that they realize they hadn't been thinking about the debate in the way that they should have been, because your wit speech was so persuasive to them. And that's ultimately what you want to be doing. Okay? There's a second part here, though, in that this function is also that you're going to serve as what we're going to call a mirror adjudicator or a mirror judge. In that what you're doing at the same time as, at the end of because you're speaking last, okay? You're speaking at the very end. And lots of times, new speakers, new debaters, will not really take that speech all that seriously. For example, they won't be actively engaged in the debate, or they'll wait until the end to kind of write out their speech. But there are things that you should be doing all the way throughout the debate. You should be flowing with the debate. You should be taking notes on every single speaker in the same way that a judge would be taking notes. Because you want to know who's winning. You want to know who, in some absolute sense, is winning this debate. Because if you don't know how the judge is thinking about the debate, then you don't know what to focus on. Let's say you're a second government, and you think that the judge is probably going to decide the one and the two are going to go to first government or second government. So you're like, okay, we're probably going to get the one or the two. That means, and if you're correct when you become good at this, if you're correct about these things, you're then able to identify what arguments to focus on. You know who you want to compare your arguments against the most. Because you know who is going to be considered in first place against you. You know who to compare against in that way. And so that's what you want to be doing. So you have to be flowing the debate. You have to be taking notes on every single speaker if you're a wit speaker. It's very important to understand, what arguments were reviewed, which arguments were reviewed, which were their strong ones, which were their weak ones, and why you want and what's happening in each and every speech. And again, you want to recognize the team that you think that's winning, especially if you don't think it's you. If it's not you, then you want to compare against the team that you think is winning. You want to try and take them down. You want to maybe, again, if you're a second government, and you think that, maybe in this case, you think first opposition is winning, you want to compare against them. You want to try and convince the judge that you were better than them. Because your argument is more important. The judge just couldn't see it because you weren't directly across from them. Because you never had that chance to interact. That's what you're trying to do. And when you do that, you have to be serving as that mirror judge. As someone who is also, at the very same time, thinking about who's winning and who's losing and why. Does that make sense to everybody? Because that's what you're trying to experience. You're trying to experience what the judge is experiencing. You're trying to be objective and stepping away and thinking to yourself, okay, those arguments are winning. Ours could be doing a better job. How do I convince the judge that they are in fact better or stronger? And again, sometimes you're able to do it, sometimes you're not. But this is the way that you can approach the wit speech in order to start figuring out exactly what it is that you need to do. Otherwise, you're approaching the wit speech with no real idea about the strategy behind it. you're approaching the whip speech with no idea about what you want to say. And by identifying what is and isn't important, which teams are winning and which teams are losing in the debate according to your view of it, you now have an ability and know what you want your whip speech to be about. You know what you want to talk about now, and it gives you a structure underlying it. And that makes it a lot easier to actually give that whip speech. It makes it far easier to give it, because now you know what you have to focus on. So again, the role of the whip speaker, or the function of it, is to provide that lens by which the judge can actually evaluate the round in a way that you, like the judge, would think that you're winning. You're going to serve as a mirror judge of some sort, because you also want to be considering and thinking about who is winning, who is losing, and what arguments are or are not important. And that's the mindset you should approach that whip speech with. You shouldn't be, for example, you shouldn't be writing anything down about your whip speech really during prep time. You should be helping your partner write that extension. And that's what we're going to talk about now, with regards to the first strategy. And then you're going to make your partner's job easier. And by helping your partner, you're going to be helping yourself as well. Before we get into this, are there any questions about the role of the whip speaker? Is there anything that was unclear? Anything at all? Okay. There will have questions at the end as well. This is going to look like a whole bunch of text, but actually, so like we were just talking about, right? You are going to be judging the round in some sense as the whip speaker. You're going to be identifying arguments. You know what argument a team refuted. You know what argument they maybe could have done a better job of doing. But your partner, right? Your partner at this same time is frantically writing out an extension. They're trying to figure out the best argument. They're trying to remember that example that they kind of knew that one time, but can't exactly remember for this one debate. That's what they're doing. That's what the extension speaker is doing at this same time. Whereas you're flowing the debate. You're writing down arguments that people are saying. And that's great. That's very good. But what ends up happening sometimes is that important arguments, your partner doesn't quite catch them. They don't quite know, because again, they might not be flowing the debate the same way. They might not catch that argument needs to be refuted because they think that enough was done. But you have your notes and you know what needs to be said. You know what arguments are still very viable, very strong in the debate round. And so this is good because you can identify that for your partner. You can pass that information over and say, this needs to be said. You need to address this point in your speech. Because if you address it, we will actually refute that argument. We will get credit for that refutation. And that team will also be weakened because of it. And so that's the idea here as well. In that, because you are taking the time to flow and to map each argument in the debate round, you have a better understanding about what has happened. You have a better understanding of who's winning against first proposition and first opposition. You have that idea, and your extension speaker might not. Not that they definitely don't. They might have a feeling for it, but you have the reasons why you think that's true, and you know how you need to fit into the debate round, and that allows you to hand over information to your partner to actually have them talk about it. Have them say it. That's very good, in particular, because it also means that you're working better together as a team. It means that each of you are able to interact and to tell one another what needs to be said. So in the same way, after the extension speaker actually gives the speech, they can come back and say, well, we're missing I didn't quite explain this as well as I wanted to. There's one particular example that I just didn't quite explain. Or it could have been explained a little bit better. And then you as the whip speaker can, in fact, go ahead and explain that a little bit better. And what ends up happening is that your team looks very, very deep. And it looks like you end up having, from the whip speech, you have that example explained better. The example was already in the member speech. Now it's on the judge's page twice. and it looks important, and it looks like it's something that you want to focus your case on. And that's good, especially if it happens to be an important example. So, though this is a pretty basic idea, in that it says, share information with your debate partner, it's something that a lot of people don't do. They don't identify an important argument that needs to be refuted because they just think it's okay if the whip speaker does it. Well, I'll just get up and I'll say it. But it will oftentimes be stronger if your partner says it first, and then you take more time in your whip speech to explain why that was important, or to explain how that affected the debate round. You say something like, this argument that first opposition had said, the first government provided this piece of refutation, but then my partner came up and said this other piece of refutation. And that made it so that the argument was no longer important in this debate round. And therefore, we're beating them right now. We are beating them. And that's what you get to say when that happens. You now reference the same thing in two different places and have told the judge why that was in fact important. And in the same way, you can sometimes give pertinent examples to your partner that they might not have the information, because you too might have very different pieces of knowledge or areas of expertise. One of you might know everything about Syria, whereas the other one of you might know everything about supply and demand and economics and all that other good stuff. And that's possible. But that means that in the case where the member of government doesn't quite have an example, that means you should pass it along to them and say, here, mention this, and I will explain it better in the whip speech. And that's fine. That's a good strategy for you to pursue. So working together is actually very important and will make you a far stronger second half team than you currently are if you're not working together in this particular way. Are there any questions about how that works? Are there any questions about what's going on with that? Nothing yet? I'm sure there will come. So, luckily, the more interesting, in fact, more fun strategy is the second one. And it's something we've talked about just a little bit with regards to how you want to serve as that mirror judge, as someone who is similarly evaluating the debate at the same time that the judge is evaluating the debate. Because you need to know what you want the judge to think. You need to know what you think is important for the judge to evaluate. And so, this is in fact your role as the mirror judge, as the mirror adjudicator. Oftentimes, it's useful to think about debates with regards to, again, if you're on the second half, maybe the judge is going to think that this debate is a top half debate. First opposition and first government will get 1 and 2, and then 3 and 4 will be between the two second half teams. Or maybe it's a government bench. Maybe first government and second government are going to get the 1 and 2, and then 3 and 4 will go to opposition. Or it could be the reverse. It could be an opposition bench. First opposition and second opposition will hit the 1 and 2. 3 and 4 will go to the government teams. That's what you want to start knowing, or start understanding with regards to what would be a persuasive or an easy call for the judge to make. What would be simple for them to just identify and say, well, this debate was an opposition bench, and then they can explain why. This is what we want to start. This is what we want to start thinking about, especially. So, additionally, what you get to do with this type of strategy in your whip speech is, if you think it's a top half debate, but you have a good chance, like this 2 to 3 is very close, and you could maybe persuade the judge to think that you were second place. And so, let's again say that your second government, first government, and first opposition look like they're winning at this particular time. Like after the extension speakers have gone, you're thinking to yourself, it really still looks like it's going to be the first half debate. It really looks like first government won, and it really looks like first opposition got second place. Does anyone have any ideas about what you would then try and convince the judge of? Let's say you have no chance in first place. They were just very good. So you make sure you rebut opening opposition. That's true. And by rebutting opening opposition, you're also trying to convey to the judge that you think it was a government bench. You're almost not working together per se, but you're trying to convince the judge that the government team was more coherent and had stronger argumentation on the whole as compared to the opposition bench. That's ultimately what you're trying to convince them of in that particular situation, because, again, you already recognize that you don't really have a chance at first place. You think that's pretty much locked up. You think second opposition is basically fourth place. So it's whether or not you get second place or third place that you can really convince the judge. That's what you get to focus on. And that's what you're implicitly doing by saying, by rebutting the vote for the opposition. You're similarly saying at the same time, your conclusion almost is that this means that it's a government, like the government has won this debate, because opposition hasn't beaten any of us. And oftentimes that works. Oftentimes if you can do this well, you can convince the judge of these things. You can persuade what the judge's ranking is going to be. You can influence it in a way that sometimes they don't even recognize. Sometimes they might already be agreeing with it perhaps. I mean, sometimes that's true. It's not always true. But the reason that this is particularly important with regards to strategy is in out-rounds. When, after you've gone through all the preliminary rounds of the competition, it's going to go from quarterfinals to semifinals to finals. And the tournament that we're going to have at the end of this week is going to follow that structure. There will likely be 16 teams, I imagine, I'm not quite sure, but I would imagine 16 teams will make it into the out-rounds. At that point, the quarterfinals, so there are 16 teams, and 8 of them will then advance. And in each debate, they're going to be choosing, who got basically the 2 teams that are going to go through, and then the 2 teams who lost. That's the decision that they're making. And so in out-rounds, this is particularly important, because your strategy shifts a little bit, in that it's always great. Your ultimate primary strategy should be to win the debate. But in the instance where you're not, or you go up against a team that's very, very good, and you're not quite there yet, you're trying to convince the judge that you and the other team, that other very strong team, were the 2 strongest teams in the round. That both of you are the ones that should go through to the next round. That both of you should be the semifinalists. And so, ultimately, if there's a team in the room that is stronger and better than you, then you want to hitch to their wagon. You want the judge to evaluate the 2 of you together by distancing yourself away from the other 2 teams. And part of the way that we do that is by actually challenging their arguments, by challenging what they're saying, and by comparing that, and making that become the most interesting comparison in the debate round. Does that make sense with regards to what you're going to do? Okay. So, the question, of course, is how do you go about doing this? Because I've told you what you need to do, but the way that, the step-by-steps on how you actually accomplish this. Well, first, you need to identify your primary competition in the debate round. And as the wit speaker, you're going to have the best ability to do this, because you're going to be able to, you're taking notes, you know what arguments have been said, you know which ones are particularly good, and you know which ones have not been refuted all that well. So, when you identify your primary competition, you're trying to think about who's either beating you or who is coming close to beating you. So if you think you're in first place and you're doing really well, you want to look around and say, okay, what other teams are kind of close? Who else would be reasonable to think that they are in first place? At that point, if you are, again, if you're in first place, that's what you want to do. If you're not, if you're saying, you're not quite sure where you are, but you know that there's at least one other team that's very, very good, they've been great, you think they're winning. You want to compare yourselves against them. You want to compare what you did, or you want to compare against what the other teams didn't do, if it's your government team, or if it's your upper house team. And so, ultimately, you want to just know these things. You want to know who is and isn't competitive for first and second place, because that provides you strategic relevance. It gives you enough information to focus something in on the speech itself. The next thing that you need to do is to actually compare that argumentation of the other strong team in the room against your team. That comparison itself is very important. Because again, that's your job. You want to be telling the judge how to think about these arguments, how to evaluate them against each other. Because if they're just two arguments that never really touch, they're always this far away from each other, they never really come together, you as the witness speaker want to throw them together. You want them to come up against each other, and then to have something at the end that you talk about. You say, and that's how these arguments interact. That's your takeaway from this. Like, they said that human life is really important. This other team said, or we said, as the second round team, that in addition to human life being important, it's also the case that we need to consider economic growth being very important as well. And then, after you compare those two against each other, you then explain why economic growth, because that's what your extension was in fact more important. Because maybe it affects more people. Maybe people have a better quality of life because of it. And that's what you get to talk about. That's how you get to compare them against each other to explain that yours is in fact more important. And so again, the contributions of each team are basically yours to evaluate. They're yours to take and to put together and to take apart and to refute and to argue with or argue against. And oftentimes that means that your role is very difficult. It oftentimes means that it's sometimes unclear what the best strategy is going to be. But these two that we've talked about today are ones that I think will definitely help and definitely make it far easier to identify what is or isn't important. The final and last piece of information with regards to this specific strategy, is that judges want what's ultimately going to be an easy decision. They want a decision that's going to be easy for them to explain. They don't want to intervene in the debate. They don't want to make an argument for you or for any team most of the time. And they shouldn't. They shouldn't ever do that. So they want to have a way of evaluating the debate round that will make it easier for them to justify what they're about to say. So if you think you're going to be first place, tell them why that's the decision, why that's the easy decision, why that's the least controversial way that they could judge the debate round. Because they don't want the controversy. They don't want you to disagree with their decision. They want you to hear the reasons for why they judged the round in the way that they did, and to say, yeah, I can understand that. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, we got third place. They want you to agree. Not always. They sometimes recognize that you won't agree. They sometimes recognize that you'll be very upset. And those things happen. But ultimately, the takeaway is that they don't want you to think that the decision was wrong. And they also don't want the decision to be wrong. And because of those reasons and those incentives for a judge, you have, as the witness speaker, do have that power to kind of influence and provide them that easy road, that road by which they can say, well, now I get it. This is the easiest way. This is the best way for me to judge the round. So second government gets first place. Then first government gets second place. And then they need to go through it step by step and really explain why those arguments interact in the way that they did. Because you just explained it to them why those arguments interact in the ways that they did. This is why that mirror judging role is very important for the witness speaker. Because as you take those notes and as you start to think of the debate in terms of a judge, rather than in terms of just as a participant, you start to understand what the judge is thinking. You start to understand what they're writing down, what they're taking notes on, and then ultimately what they're going to think is important. And so when that happens, when you start to make that shift, you become pretty good at it. Because I'm certain, in fact, that almost all of you, after a debate round, you probably talk about yourself and say, so what did you think? What do you think happened around? Who got first, who got second, who got third, who got fourth? I'm sure you probably have those discussions. Maybe it's just among you and your partner, and you kind of guess, right? Like you've been at a tournament, you kind of guess, you're like, well, I don't know, I think maybe we got third, or maybe we got second. It's unclear. And then the judge will talk back and they'll give you the decision. The whip speaker, by and large, should have a good idea of what the judge is going to say. It's almost like you have the secret knowledge, right? Like, well, I think this is what they're going to say and how they're going to judge it. Because you know the way that they're thinking about the round. And that's why it's important to step back and almost to become less of a participant in some way, and more of a judge who's also participating in the round. You that are like, here's what's incomplete on your notes. You know what needs to be said, and you know what's going to come next. Are there any questions about that? Any questions at all with regards to either of the strategies that we just talked about, or even some talking about the functions of the speech or anything? Yes?
Yeah. So, for example, my partner is a member, just simply this claim there, and what my elaboration for that claim notes and helping me. Like, in my web speech, I elaborate on that claim, and would that be treated as something new?
Okay. So this is a good question about what is and is not considered new in web speech. Elaborating on a claim, let's put it this way. Anytime that you're making a new argument, you shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be saying, and now, again, in the web speech, and now my new argument is going to be this. It's really that you should be able to identify that you can explain analysis more, or you can explain the claim that someone makes better. But you can't make a new claim and then prove that claim within the round. Because that is, in fact, just a new argument. And the judge shouldn't punish you. They just shouldn't give you credit for it. Okay? It's not a matter of, it's not like, oh, well, we made a new argument in this web speech, therefore you got fourth place. That should never be happening. That's bad judgment, in fact. Ultimately, they shouldn't give you credit for this new argument. Because what if that was the winning argument? Let's say you were the opposition whip, and you make the winning argument in your web speech. Nobody gets a chance to respond to it. Nobody gets to say anything to it. And that's not good. You want people to have a chance to respond, and it's in fact unfair. So, new examples, new analysis, comparisons, all of that is okay. All of that is fine, so long as it's not structured as an argument. You explain why this new example that you're bringing up in the web speech is in fact related or supports a claim that maybe your partner made, or maybe it disproves an argument that somebody else made. And that's okay, because again, you're similar, you can refute in your web speech as well. You can explain why arguments weren't very good, or why a claim wasn't all that great. And sometimes that requires some new analysis. It requires something, it requires you to provide new material that's responsive rather than constructive. You don't want to make something new, but it's okay to respond to what's already happened in the debate, or to support things that have already happened in the debate. And as long as you're explaining why it either supports it, or is responding against something, or serves as like a good example that highlights something that your partner said, as long as you're tying it back to those things, it's okay. There's not really anything problematic about that. And most judges have a fairly loose standard. Like, they're not going to say that most new things in a web speech aren't a new argument. It's rarely the case that a brand new argument is made in a web speech. And so just be aware, but ultimately, I don't think I've really seen much of it with regards to any of the practice debates that I've watched. And I've seen quite a few of you speak as well, so that's, I just haven't really seen much of that happen. Okay? The idea, yeah, go ahead.
I have a hard time coming up with an effective debate structure so that you can capture the most important reactions to this debate and state it like in the bias of the division. I have a hard time coming up with that.
Well, so there are two things. The question was that he was explaining that he's coming up with, or there's difficulty coming up with a good structure in order to capture as much of the debate as possible. Now again, going back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, your role isn't necessarily to serve primarily as a summary. You want to talk about important arguments and important ideas in the debate round, but not just because you have to summarize them. That's not the idea here. The idea here, when you're moving up to more advanced versions of whip speeches, is that you're going to take ideas and bounce them against each other. And so the way that you structure that are a couple different ways. Lots of people, I still even see at very high levels of debate, people still will use questions as a way of structuring their whip speech. Things that are still left unanswered in some ways. Do we value human rights over economic development? If we do, if we value human rights over economic development, then which human rights are most important? Those are ways that you can structure a whip speech and actually talk about the arguments within the debate round itself. Because you've now, again, you're provided, in some ways, you're providing a structure over the debate round itself where everything kind of fits in, or the important things at least fit in. And that's what we want to do. Oftentimes, it's not the easiest thing to come up with a debate structure, or with a whip speech structure. But ultimately, when you start thinking about it in terms of the questions or in terms of disagreements with regards to what each side has said, it becomes a little bit easier. What is the main thing, or what are 2 or 3 main things that government and opposition disagree about? What are fundamentally different about them? What do they pursue this debate about? And that starts to allow you access to a structure for your whip speech. Additionally, though, another useful way of thinking of this is to think about what each side must do or must argue well in order to win. So when you're on, let's say you're on proposition, right, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, what did opposition need to prove in order to win this debate? What did the proposition need to prove in order to win this debate? And that then gives you the ideas underlying the arguments that each side should have focused on, that each side needed to talk about. And then you're able to evaluate the debate against that structure, or against that almost absolute, standard, by saying, here's an important way that government and opposition disagree. Here's the standard that they should have really been focusing on, because they needed to prove these things in order to win the debate round. And then they didn't. Here's how they didn't. Because this argument that they made doesn't help them explain this concept. That's the idea, and that's the way that you can really start to generate a structure for whip speech. But again, it's also very individualistic. You're figuring out what's important, and you're writing it down onto your page in order to stand up and do the best speech possible. Some of them might look very different from the way that I do it. I write down, I take 1 or 2 quick, let's say I'm doing 3. I have 3 quick titles, and that's pretty much it. I have maybe 2 or 3 more words written underneath each of them, and that I was able to talk about it. Other people that I know have very complicated structures for their speeches. They divide their page into a column down the left-hand side, and then they have so they can put little pieces of information in. Then they put lines all the way across it, so they can fill in each individual box. And then they draw another line down on the other side, and on the other side, they do other small little pieces that they need to talk about, because they need that structure on their page in order for them to give the best whip speech possible. And that's what we're looking to do. Some people will tell you that there's a right and a wrong way to do it, and there just isn't. There just isn't a right way for you to structure your notes. The right way is the way that makes it most clear to you what you need to say. The way that makes you most able to get up here and give that speech. That's what you should be focusing on within your whip speech on your page. and the ways in which you can give the best possible version of the speech that you want to give. And if your notes are bad, or if you can't read them, or if you're trying to do something that somebody once told you was a good idea, you might not be able to give that best speech because you're trying to do something that you just can't quite do. Not because you're bad at it, but because that doesn't serve as the best means of conveying what you want to convey. Are there any more questions? Yes? Well then, so as the witness speaker, let's say it looks like it's a government bench, and you want to get first or second, but that's you really want this. So then you start thinking to yourself, which of those two teams is weaker? Which of those two teams, again, not in an absolute sense, but with regards to the weakest team within the debate, the team that has done the least good job of arguing to everybody. And then you're just going to try and beat that team in your speech. You're going to explain, so let's say second government. Second government is the weaker team here. So, if second government is the weaker team, you can focus your whip speech on comparing your partner's extension with the extension that they made on second government. And then you're going to explain why your extension beat that extension, why it's more important, the actual comparison between the two. And that's the way that you kind of change the judge's opinion of it. That's the way that you explain to them that though you think first government is coming in first, second should actually go to second opposition, and third should go to the second government. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question? So in the event that the argument doesn't clash, you sometimes just need to figure out a way to compare them, even if they don't clash against each other. So maybe you're talking about, but in that sense, everything you can compare any of these arguments against each other. It just happens to be that it might be you saying that, again, let's say they talk about economic development as being very important, and you're explaining why environment and protecting the environment is actually much more important. Those two things don't clash. I mean, they kind of do. But they clash in the sense that once you compare them, then you can start to identify ways that your arguments beat those arguments. So what you end up doing is you use your arguments as refutation, in some sense, against the first argument's arguments. And you make that comparison instead. And that's fine. Because at that point, you're also convincing the judge. At that point, you're convincing the judge as well that it's a backup debate. That second government and second opposition are going to get the first and the second. So the other thing that you're doing, within this strategy, the other thing that you're doing is recognizing that we're trying to convince the judge that the most important argumentation happened between these two teams, between second government and second opposition. That's what you're trying to convince the judge of. So, if you can convince the judge that the most interesting debate actually happened between those two teams, and that first government and first opposition, they were fine, but they weren't having the most interesting debate, they weren't clashing the most, then, you'll get the one or the two at that point, because you're able to explain to the judge that this debate was the most important debate. The debate between you and second opposition, or second government. The debate between you and second government. Does that make sense? Okay. Are there any more questions? Okay, well, it is now 1:55, and I'm going to let you all go so that you can check and see what maybe next elective you want to go to, because we have approximately 5 minutes before that one starts, and ideally we'll get there on time and people will show up. Thank you very much. You guys are all an excellent audience. This is very good.